Welcome back to the Justice Factor. 2 out of every 3 people under the age of 24 are unable to find and sustain a job, according to Harambe, a private sector group that finds work for underprivileged youth. This week, Stats SA said the number of unemployed people increased by 100,000 to 4.6 million between the fourth quarter of 2012 and the first quarter of 2013. What is government doing about this? Minister for Economic Planning, Ebrahim Patel, joined us on Saturday to discuss this. Minister, welcome to the show. The unemployment numbers came out this week, and to me, it looks like a disaster. Extra 100,000 people in the first quarter without jobs. Wouldn't you agree with me that it is a disaster?
Justice, I think it's mixed news. On the one hand, the economy created 44,000 new jobs in the first 3 months of the year, 199,000 new jobs for the 12 months that ended in March this year. But in the first quarter, you also have large numbers of new entrants into the labor market. People who have left school, who have left university. So we had 144,000 new people coming into the labor market.
Since 2008, you've actually lost 400,000 jobs. If you look at since 1994, we've basically been stuck on a 24%, 25% unemployment rate. This is a recipe for disaster. It looks like the Arab Spring.
I think unemployment is, without any question, our biggest economic challenge. But let's look at where we've come to. In 1994, we had about between 8 and 9 million employed people. Today, we have 13.5 million employed people. The reason why the unemployment rates remain high is we are a young population, and there are large numbers of new people entering the labor market every year. You know, in 2010, government adopted the new growth path at the end of the year. Since then and today, the economy has created more than 600,000 new jobs. The big job loss was during the global economic crisis. We're a very integrated economy in the global economy. When demand slackens in Europe or the United States, we lose jobs here. One of the things that's not often known, Justice, is that many economies have not recovered from the global recession. The UK, the economy today, is still smaller than it was at the low point of the recession.
I would say to you, that's Europe, that's the US, that's the West. If you look at the rest of the continent, and this is a point that's been made this week at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, was that many of these economies are growing way better than us. With us at 2.5, 2.7% growth and possibly 3.4% in 2014, actually we're not going anywhere. We're going to be stuck on this 25% unemployment rate.
It depends on what we do from here. I think one of the successes of the last few years has been to reorient more of our economic relations to the rest of the African continent and to the fast-growing BRICS economies. But remember that we've had a historic legacy over many, many years of principally selling in Europe and the United States. Now, as we build new trade relations, we see new job creation. Africa is the big success story. And African growth is driven principally, although not only, by oil prices. So the big, fast-growing African economies are Nigeria, are Angola, and so on. South Africa is beginning to get a slice of that action. You know, we started to look at the job numbers. I did an analysis, and 90,000 jobs in South Africa is dependent purely on what we sell to the rest of the continent by way of manufactured products. Here's one more little statistic. 1 out of 5 Ford buckies made in Pretoria is sold elsewhere on the African continent.
That's pretty good. However, are you confident that will make that 5 million jobs target by 2020 that was promised at the beginning of this decade?
We can do it. It means that we must work differently, but the 5 million jobs is possible provided we make job creation our central focus in everything that we do in the economy. We've recently signed the Youth Employment Accord. I think that that's going to open up the real opportunities to bring young people in numbers into the economy.
Perhaps the reason why we want, I'm not totally convinced that we'll make that 5 million jobs by 2020 is because we don't seem to have an economic policy. You've spoken about the national growth path. A lot of people in government, the ANC has adopted the National Development Plan. Your ally in the tripartite alliance, COSATU, says it's a reworking of gear which gave us jobless growth for 8, 9 years. So essentially saying the next 7 years will be like the first 7 years of the 2000s.
You know, in economic policy in many countries, national targets are set by a growth target, by how much we want to expand our gross domestic product, our GDP. Both the National Development Plan, which is the overall vision, and the New Growth Path, which is the economic strategy of government, have set a jobs target. It says you can't measure progress simply by the rate of growth. You have to look at how many people are employed. So we're beginning now to focus on how can you ensure that you have what we call jobs-rich growth. Not just growth, not just jobless growth, but growth that disproportionately bring young people and bring the unemployed into employment.
But we're going back to the same point. It doesn't seem like since 2010, when the NGP was first put on the table, when I look at it, it seems as if we're just stuck in that one position. Are we?
No, I think the good news, and I must qualify it, but the good news is more than 600,000 new jobs were created since the adoption of the New Growth Path. Our challenge is we've got to now increase that even more, because the shape of the South African population is really very large numbers of young people, and they enter the labor market every year. China indeed has a smaller challenge because their population is distributed across all age groups. We need to have a much higher job creation rate even than China to be able to meet our national targets. And that's really what the New Growth Path is about.
But this is the central challenge. When I look back at the past 19 years, how many times and for how long can we say to these young people who are, I mean, just one number, more than 2 million young people have actually are out there without, and they're not looking for jobs. Now, those young people sitting at home in Soweto, in wherever in South Africa, how long can we keep saying to them, jobs, jobs, jobs will give you jobs, without them saying it's time to protest? And if you look at the number of service delivery protests in South Africa, this, for me, this is a recipe for implosion. And I would say the African National Congress is failing those young people and has failed them over the past 19 years.
If you look at the figures, they tell a different story. We have 1.6 million additional young people in employment today compared to the start of the democracy. But I do think, and I want to accept, that youth employment is a major, major challenge that we have to address. So we've got to increase jobs for young people much more. Where do we start? Schooling and skills. It has to start there. The University of Stellenbosch released results a few weeks ago that showed that the unemployment rate among people with degrees is substantially lower than it is for any other category. And it makes sense. Skilled people can be absorbed into the economy more quickly. And so it's on that front that we're putting money, ideas, and partnership. And we've got the private sector and the unions agreeing with us that more needs to be done on improving the skills level. So we're introducing a second chance matric for those who did not complete their basic schooling and their high schooling. We're focusing a lot more on further education and training colleges, and we're ensuring that companies provide apprenticeships and learnerships for young people.
And yet we continue to have in the system, in your administration, a situation where textbooks don't get to kids, where we seem to be kowtowing to the demands of trade unions like SATU, which decide to go on strike as they did 2 weeks ago, or go on go-slows, while we essentially, you're saying, our education system is not producing the material we need.
Justice, let's break them into two different challenges that we face. The one is to make sure that there's learning materials at school. And I think
there we failed.
Well, I think last year we had a major challenge, particularly in Limpopo and some other areas. These are responsibilities of provinces. We've cracked the whip very, very clearly and said it's not acceptable.
We haven't seen anyone actually being accountable. The Premier of Limpopo should have been fired for that.
I think what you saw in Limpopo is national government stepping in, using unusual powers in our constitution to take over the provincial administration at the provincial level. That is quite a dramatic response. And we will see this year certainly a much better performance. We've got to get that right. There's absolutely no question about that. But we must also recognize that there is progress in our high school system. We've had an improvement in the matric pass rate. And this
people pass when they get 33% in maths, science. I don't know if that's good enough to actually enter the job market or to become a welder.
Well, you know, if you take welding as an example, and I want to illustrate that, we don't have an artisanal culture in South Africa. So when you finish matric, the predominant emphasis is to go to university, become a doctor, a lawyer, a finance director. It's creating a culture where people who leave matric, albeit with the results that we have here, can go into further education and training, can become artisans, welders, plumbers, bricklayers. They're the kind of categories that you need in a competitive economy. Germany is a fantastic example of a society that's invested in these technical skills to ensure that, in fact, they have that kind of competitive, strong, dynamic economy.
On that point, on the jobs issue on young people, do you support the youth wage subsidy?
In the Youth Employment Accord, we've agreed with COSATU and with business that incentives must play a role. But what the unions have said are two things, which we have taken on board as government. One, that you need a comprehensive response. Simply putting an incentive alone on the table is not going to resolve this problem. And secondly, you've got to design that incentive so that you don't simply replace older workers with younger workers with no net gain. So I think we've moved way beyond the debate about the youth wage subsidy. We now have a package of measures in that Youth Employment Accord that includes an incentive that companies can access to increase the number of jobs for young people.
What are you going to do about the collusion that has been found in the construction industry? What's your end point in this debate?
The end point must clearly be to break up the cartels, the price fixing, the collusion. It's very, very extensive. Just short of about 300 instances of collusion on projects have been identified by the Competition Commission. We've been very active as government in identifying where the problem is and beginning to resolve it. There's going to be stiff penalties. There's going to be disclosure by all these companies. In fact, the big companies have all come forward and admitted it, and they'll have to dismantle these cartels.
What would it mean if after they pay all these fines and go through the whole issue, then they have to fire workers because they have lost so much money? Isn't that the consequence of what you're doing?
No, on the contrary. The level of construction is actually going to increase. The question is, do companies take a portion of the money that the state put on the table and push it straight into the bottom line simply by colluding on price? We need a more competitive economy. And so on the construction side, it's very clear what we're doing. It will have, if anything, a boost for jobs, because if construction companies don't collude, then the state can put more money on the table. We can have more infrastructure programs being run.
You've also announced an investigation into private medical healthcare companies. Why are you doing that? A lot of people would say to you, actually, if you want to implement the NHI, the problem is that the public sector is not providing well enough, and that's why business has stepped in, and therefore the Justice Malalas of this world go to private institutions instead of going to the local clinic.
We have two problems in the health sector. In the public sector, it's the quality of medical care. In the private sector, it's the cost of medical care. Ordinary South Africans will know that medical care has become unaffordable. The price of medical aid is rising constantly because hospital fees, specialist fees, and so on are very, very high.
But that's the creation of government, because government is failing to provide me with the alternative that would make those private healthcare providers realize that they don't have a business if they continue with their expensive ways.
No, I think what government inherited in 1994 was a very large private sector health industry that focused on people in medical aids, on people in the middle class, and so on. So we have a responsibility to ensure that in protecting South Africans, that the cost of medical care comes down. We will use new powers in the Competition Act that allows the Competition Commission to do a market inquiry into what causes these prices to rise in the way that they do. And we want to cast the net as wide as possible bring some transparency, some openness to prices. We've heard stories, the Minister of Health has shared with us information on hospital fees and specialist fees, and we need to give the industry an opportunity to set out the figures for us and to indicate to us why costs are rising as much as they are.
Minister, we've run out of time, but I'd like to, with the collusion investigation, the investigation into private healthcare, a lot of people are saying your ministry seems to be hell-bent on punishing business with all these investigations, new legislation, new regulations. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't think that's at all right. The private healthcare thing is very interesting. We've had complaints from the private sector itself. Companies have said to us that their wage bills are being driven up by the fact that workers have to pay very substantial premiums to medical aid schemes. In the construction side, ultimately, business has to pay the cost when private companies collude, because in the end, the state has to take that via corporate tax, via VAT, and via pay-as-you-earn. So, if anything, what we're doing here is creating a culture in which we bring down the cost of doing business, which has strong competitive effects on the economy. But we do it in a way that supports consumers, supports job creation, and support the kind of economy that we want to see.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Well, thank you, and happy Mother's Day to all the mothers of the nation.
News that moves. ENCA.com.